Welcome back. Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa says that the draft National Implementation Framework is intended to build a professional public sector better suited to serving the people. Now, the framework is also intended to insulate the state from undue political interference and unmerited appointments. In his weekly newsletter issued yesterday, the president said that when he was elected president of South Africa, his commitment was to build an efficient, capable and ethical state staffed by men and women who are professional, skilled and free from corruption. Now, the framework was approved by Cabinet in November last year and has been open for public consultations with various sectors of society for the past 2 weeks. And to discuss this further and perhaps look at it in a little more detail, we're joined by Rekgotsofetse Chikane, who is a lecturer at the Wits School of Governance. Thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Mr. Chikane, let's start off with your understanding of what exactly this draft National Implementation Framework that the President wrote about is meant to achieve.
So in a nutshell, it's working towards the depoliticization of the state, right, and the state apparatus. And what that really means is that you're trying to get a public service whose incentive structure is more aligned to the natural needs of citizens rather than the natural needs of a political party. But it's always a fine line to kind of follow, and it's not something that's fundamentally new or different, right? The civil service of South Africa is jam-packed with administrators and bureaucrats who are not necessarily politically aligned. But when your incentive structure, when your senior managers can only be appointed to that level if you're part of a political party, if your type of promotion journey should be linked to your position within a political party, what that ends up doing is that it perverses the system. It de-incentivizes individuals of doing hard work. It incentivizes the notion of patronage networks, using government to formulate your patronage networks. And in that case, the president's really trying to say, how do we stop this perverse incentive structure and create some sort of system that allows ordinary bureaucrats who are skilled, who are competent, who have a level of integrity, in his words, to move up the ranks of the public service and fill up those positions?
How do we do that? Because the president, interestingly, says that the framework will professionalize, as you point out, the public service and build that sort of state capacity that would, in the first instance, be of service and serve the people better, and also insulate them, the public servants from undue political interference. But how do you actually do that? And how is a policy meant to achieve that?
So there's multiple steps in this framework. So one of the most important ones really comes at the most senior level, and it's the idea of making sure that the Public Service Commission, which is supposed to be this independent body, sits on all the interviews of Director Generals and DDGs and to some extent HODs of departments, right? And that's to essentially have a person in the room who's able to ask the tough questions, who's not politically aligned about what is the future of this person within the department, what are their allegiances to their own political party, how do we mitigate against that? So that's one particular angle. A second particular angle is the idea of how do we get public servants to undergo what they will call compulsory examinations. And these compulsory examinations, right, can really be hit or miss. Right? So the president wants to say that every public servant has to do some sort of exam in order to join the public service. Now, how tough this exam is will really determine the type of caliber of public servants that you get into the administration, right? And when you look internationally at governments that embark on compulsory examinations for their public servants, they're considered some of the toughest examinations in the country at that particular moment in time. So we really need to find these different mechanisms of doing things, but simply putting a policy in place that says we're going to depoliticize doesn't actually mean that that policy will work, because the government has tried this many times before, whether it was during the Mbeki years, whether it's during the Zuma years. What Ramaphosa is proposing is not necessarily new. What he's actually trying to do is really change the meat of these policies so they actually have some sort of bite.
And of course, as you point out, it isn't new. This framework will make sure that appointments are made on merit, the president writes. But again, by the president's own implied admission, people are currently being appointed by other means rather than merit. And when we look at something like corruption and we say it is systemic, how again do we take this new national implementation policy framework beyond what already exists and what we are grappling with in the public sector?
Yeah, so at the Wits School of Governance, a lot of our work is that we train quite a few public officials, so mid to senior career public officials. And one of the dominant narratives that you hear from them is that they don't feel as if, even though they might get this master's degree, they might get this honors degree, that the system is incentivized in such a way that you can naturally move up the ranks, right? That if you work hard enough, if you do your job, that you can one day become the Director General without ever joining a political party. And what that ends up doing is that from the top to bottom, it means that from your Director General to your DDG to your Deputy Directors, all the way down to your HODs, if those become political appointments, then again, the incentive structure becomes perverse. And that's where the systemic issue comes in, right? If someone is corrupt, they're corrupt, right? So the president wants us to go through, wants public servants to do integrity exams as well. But if you're a corrupt official, one of the good things about being a corrupt official is that you can lie really, really well. So simply doing an integrity test doesn't change anything if someone wants to be corrupt. What you have to fundamentally do is change the incentive structure that disincentivizes someone from being corrupt and incentivizes someone to essentially say, I just want to do my job, I just want to go about my day, I want to make this country a better place. And I think that will be the challenge of this framework, of finding that balance and also having a big enough stick. And that becomes the real challenge of this, that if someone does break the rules, right, if a department does do some sort of bad hiring system where you further perpetuate a patronage system, what do you do to punish those individuals? How do you make an example of a head of department who circumvents the normal hiring process? And if that doesn't take place, then it really doesn't make sense.
And that's an interesting point, because if you look at this letter, at the onset of the letter, the president says that he was elected and he's committed to build a capable and ethical state free from corruption. But we shouldn't forget that this is also the same President Ramaphosa who is on record as saying that he would rather be seen as a weak president than one who divides the ANC.
Yeah, so this becomes one of those tough calls. One of my biggest criticisms of Cyril Ramaphosa is not necessarily his presidential term, but when you act as president who wants to have a second term in office, what that ends up doing is that you become really soft in a lot of things out of the hope that you finish your second term and you can finish really hard. But the ANC has a really bad track record of presidents finishing their second term. So it would be really nice for him to come out and say, as the head of the executive wing of this party, it is time for us to flex the muscles of the executive wing and make it compulsory for us to follow these policies. The divides within the ANC, which have been going on for the better part of the past 15 years, if not even more, right, are really leaking into our normal public administration processes, right, where I will hire an HOD who's part of my faction instead of another faction. An argument I often used to have just after the Polokwane conference was that, we went through something that was quite dramatic, which was a complete overhaul of our administrative system, even though the country didn't know it. Whole-scale political appointments were made from top to bottom, from national all the way to local. And all it did was fundamentally disrupt that system. And in order to stop that from becoming an entrenched process, there needs to be a status quo that says that the public administration will be neutral, and not necessarily say we're blind to all politics. That would be a naive position to take, right? As a public administrator, you are in charge of implementing the mandate of a political party that's there. That's really your job. You can't say that I don't want to do it because I don't like that political party. But there has to be a tool that says, regardless of the political party that's in charge, we have a capable state of implementing the mandate that's given.
But is there any real political will to change the status quo, or are we just going through the motions and dealing with platitudes?
Yeah, so I genuinely believe that the majority of public servants in this country are well-intentioned, well-hearted individuals, right? That there's this belief that the public servants of our country might not be as skilled as they should be, might not be as capacitated as they should be. The one thing I don't doubt is that there's a commitment to the country. Now, they just might be bad at their job, but the commitment doesn't need you to be good at your job. And I think what needs to happen is to say, how do you get that particular contingent of society asking the question of how do we also change this for our own upward mobility, especially during a time in which the public service bill is going to be slashed, right? Where the public service of South Africa is going to reduce. The incentive should be for ordinary members of the public service to actively push for this. It can't just be outside civil society. It can't just be political commentators who say this is good. There has to be a realization from those within government that if you don't do this, you're going to lose a job. And the only way you can get your job is if you stay within a particular political party. And if you don't want to do that, then you're kind of stuck. And I think that becomes the real key. Again, it shouldn't just be the outside influence wagging their finger at the public service saying this is the right thing to do. It really has to be some sort of endogenous growth path within the public service that says this is the right thing.
But the reality is different. And we know that people don't necessarily lose their jobs, especially the higher up you go within the ranks of the public service.
Oh, yeah.
Last week, President Ramaphosa said in Parliament, and I quote, he said that days of messing up are over. Professional people will run local government, unquote. He also said that the Zondo Commission has managed to lay bare the depths of corruption. Well, we've known this. A lot of what has been ventilated at the Zondo Commission. But the president is also the one who received the high-level review report into what was going on at the State Security Agency by Sydney Mufamadi. But instead, the self-same president still redeployed implicated ministers to his executive. Arthur Fraser is still in charge of correctional services again.
Yeah.
What's going on?
So I think the important thing to realize around Cyril Ramaphosa in particular, and a lot of people seem to miss this, is that he's playing the long game. And the long game was several different steps. And it was, you can't go after people that you might not like or who might be against you if the institutions in which you need to utilize are politicized, right? So if the institutions such as the NPA is dysfunctional, if the institutions such as the South African police force is dysfunctional and is politicized, and your intelligence services is politicized, simply using them to attack other people doesn't really solve the problem. And his long game has been, how do I get capacity within these institutions so that they naturally are able to do their job without him having to come out with a big stick? And that's been his tactic for the past few years. Whether it works or not is we have to wait for the long game to kind of play out. And that becomes the challenge, I guess. Now, how we use other aspects of society, for instance, to kind of change this notion. So the Zondo Commission, I kind of like the Zondo Commission. It's like the friend who tells you a story that you've heard before, but they're telling it as if they've never heard this story before, right? South Africans deeply understand the context and the depth of our corruption, the systemic level of corruption. What I think people miss necessarily is how this corruption perpetuates the worst within our society, right? This notion of poverty, unemployment, and income inequality. But how it perverses that system to an extent that it really affects public servants as well. And this is why I want to go back to this notion that public servants, even though it might be pie in the sky, time is up, right? There's no cash in our coffers anymore. The biggest bill on our essentially budget sheet is the government service wage bill, right? And once that gets cut, yes, the fat cats, the politically connected HODs might stay on top, but the people at the bottom will lose their jobs. And that would really kill the capacity within our public service. So there becomes this need to balance out, how do you have the long-term ambitions of getting the institutions right, so that regardless if you have a Ramaphosa, you really shouldn't have a really good president in order to stop corruption. You should really have a mediocre president and have the institutions that can still protect you against the worst of corruption, right? So you have to balance out what this long game looks like. How do you get to those end outcomes? And then balance that out against how do you make sure that the ordinary citizen is able to do the type of job they need to do to make sure that whilst we're waiting for these outcomes to come to place from these institutions, that we're not essentially sinking the boat at the same time, that we're keeping ourselves afloat. And I think that's really the strategy that's at play.
But isn't the reality that we are dealing with institutional paralysis in the South African context? Because, again, going back to the Zondo Commission, testimony by former MPs like Vincent Smith and Dikeledi Magadzi, they admitted that Parliament is incapable of holding SOE officials, for example, to account effectively.
Yep.
So why are we talking about policy when here we have something that's clear, it is glaringly obvious? Why aren't we addressing that issue?
Yeah, I think I'd mentioned this in previous articles and discussions. Our political system is broken, fundamentally, right? If we really wanted to say, let's put aside the discussion of policy because we're neither here nor there about it, a real conclusion is that the way that our political system functions as it currently is broken because it doesn't incentivize holding people accountable in any particular way. And I've said this on multiple different occasions. I think our proportional-based representation system within Parliament adversely stops people from holding our public servants accountable. There needs to be a change there because even if the ANC was to remove, right, and the DA came into power or the EFF would come into power, because we have normalized the lack of accountability within our institutions. So it's not just an individual, but it's the culture of the institution that's normalized not holding people accountable. It doesn't matter who you get into place, really, at the end of the day, if citizens aren't able to hold their public officials accountable. So I agree with you in that sense, that it has to be a complete overhaul. There are suggestions that you embark on a constituency-based system of some sort, that essentially says I want to hold someone accountable, and the person I'm holding accountable is the individual that I vote for in particular. So without that change, you're absolutely right. We're playing a useless game, essentially, without really thinking about what are the fundamental reforms that we have to make to our political system. Now, the question, and this is the big one, is how can we trust parliaments to make those own decisions when they've now shown themselves to be incapable of holding their own executive accountable, right? When people are incentivized to be in the position that they're in to maintain the status quo, why should we leave it in their hands to make the decision of what political reform looks like? And that becomes an interesting give and take that we're about to go into.
We're out of time, but I just want to squeeze this question in 30 seconds, if you can, Mr. Chikane. Yeah. What do you make of the announcement that another anti-corruption advisory council will be appointed to report to Parliament?
I think it means that our institutions are broken, right? We have institutions in place within our constitution, within our executive, within Parliament that should be able to do this job. So when you start up a task team to look into corruption in particular, it means something fundamentally wrong has happened. My last comment on this is a clear example of this, is that our Chapter 9 institutions in this country should be used to fight against the worst of the worst in our society. Yet our Chapter 9 institutions for the past decade have been underfunded on a systemic level. And that gives an example of how we delegitimize our institutions that are made to protect us against the worst in our society.
Well, that's all we have time for, but thank you so much for your time, Rekgotsofetse Chikane from the Wits School of Governance, discussing President Ramaphosa's draft national implementation framework with us. And as always, you're welcome to tell us what your views are. But let's